The sky above the jagged ridges of the Bighorn Mountains was the color of bruised iron. It was a heavy, suffocating gray that promised not just snow, but a burying winter. The wind did not howl. It moaned, a low and constant vibration that rattled the brittle, leafless stalks of the cottonwoods lining the frozen creek bed. Elu knelt in the frost-heaved earth. The cold had long ago stolen the feeling from her fingers, turning them into clumsy, wooden tools. She gripped a fractured edge of a bison rib, a scavenger's prize found days ago, and drove it into the unyielding soil. The earth resisted, hard as granite under the breath of the approaching deep winter. She leaned her meager weight onto the bone, gritting her teeth as the dull pain shot up her forearm. The dirt finally cracked, yielding a handful of frozen dust and a single shriveled root of wild licorice. It was no thicker than a twig, fibrous and bitter, but she brushed the dirt from it with desperate care and slipped it into the worn leather pouch at her belt. She paused, her lungs burning with the sharp, icy air, and allowed herself a moment to close her eyes. She was 24 winters old, a woman of the Tsitsistas, born to a lineage of resilient women who knew how to coax life from the dry plains and the high basins. But none of her mother's teachings, none of the ancient stories shared by the fire, had prepared her for this absolute, crushing isolation. 2 moons had passed since the world ended. It had not ended with a roar of thunder or a shaking of the earth, but with the sharp crack of Springfield rifles and the rhythmic, terrifying thunder of shod horses striking the summer grass. The blue-coated soldiers had come in the pale light of dawn. They had not come to parley. They had come to erase. Elu remembered the smell of burning buffalo hides, the thick, choking black smoke rising from the winter stores of dried meat and pemmican. She remembered the chaotic screaming of the horses and the sight of her husband, strong and steady, turning back toward the lodge with his bow drawn, shouting for her to run. She had run. She had dragged her daughter, Suyeta, and her dead sister's son, Keme, into the dense, thorny brush of the ravines, putting the earth between them and the slaughter. She had waited for her husband to follow. He never did. Now she opened her eyes and looked back. Huddled beneath the gnarled roots of a fallen pine, 20 paces away, were the children. They sat clumped together beneath a single moth-eaten buffalo robe. The fur was worn down to the stiff hide in patches, offering little defense against the wind. Suyeta, 7 winters old, sat with her knees pulled to her chest. Her dark hair, once braided with care and tied with strips of red cloth, was matted with pine pitch and dirt. Her face was gaunt, the cheekbones sharp against her hollowed cheeks. Beside her, 5-year-old Kem leaned heavily against his cousin. His eyes were half closed, his breathing shallow. The most terrifying thing was the silence. Children were meant to be loud. They were meant to run, to ask questions, to complain of tired legs or empty bellies. In the first weeks, Kame had cried for his mother, for the warmth of the lodge fires, for food. Elu had soothed him, feeding him lies about a valley ahead where the game was plentiful. But hunger was a thief that stole even the energy for tears. The crying had stopped 3 days ago. Now they simply watched her with wide, dark eyes, waiting for a miracle she could not provide. Elu pushed herself up from the frozen ground. Her joints popped, stiff and aching. Her moccasins, patched with pieces of bark and tied with sinew, were soaked through from the snowdrifts they had crossed the day before, the leather frozen solid around her bruised feet. She wore a dress of elk skin, but beneath it she was wasting away, her own body consuming its muscle to keep the fire in her heart beating. She walked back to the children, the snow crunching loudly under her feet. "Stand up, Suyeta," Elu said. Her voice was raspy, stripped of its musical cadence by thirst and cold. Suyeta blinked slowly, looking up at her mother. "My feet are heavy, Neahe. I know. But if we sit, the cold will climb into our bones and go to sleep. We must walk to stay awake." Elu reached down, grasping the girl's thin arm, and gently pulled her to her feet. Kemi did not move. He whimpered softly as the robe shifted, exposing him to the biting wind. Elu knelt beside him. She took his small, icy hands in hers, rubbing them briskly, though she had no warmth of her own to give. "Keme," she whispered, leaning close so the wind would not steal her words. "Look at me." The boy's heavy eyelids fluttered open. "We are going to the canyon where the trees touch the sky," she told him, pointing a trembling finger toward a distant, darker cleft in the mountains. "The wind cannot follow us there. The pine needles are thick and we can make a bed, but I cannot carry you. You must use your warrior legs." It was a cruel thing to demand of a starving child, but mercy in this landscape meant death. Pity was a luxury of the warm and the well-fed. Elu hauled the boy up, adjusting the heavy robe around his shoulders. She took the front edge of the hide, securing it under his chin, and then took his hand. With her other hand, she gripped Suyeta's shoulder. "Step where I step," Elu commanded. They began to move. Elu broke the trail. The snow in the valley was erratic. In some places, the wind had scoured the ground bare, leaving slick, black ice, while in others, the drifts reached her knees. Every step required lifting her leg high, plunging it into the crust, and dragging the exhausted children forward in her wake. The rhythm of their walking became a grim meditation. Asterisk, breathe in the ice. Step, pull. Breathe out the pain. Step, pull. For hours, the only sounds were the howling of the mountain drafts, the wet tearing of the snow beneath their feet, and the ragged, shallow breathing of the children behind her. Elu kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, constantly scanning. She was looking for movement, a hare, a grouse, even a squirrel. She still had her husband's skinning knife tucked in her belt. It was a poor weapon for hunting, but if she found an animal frozen in the drifts, she could cut the meat. But the land was dead. The animals had long since retreated into their burrows or migrated to the lower plains. The bighorns had become a tomb. By midday, the gray light began to fail, swallowed by the thickening clouds. The wind picked up, driving tiny, razor-sharp crystals of ice horizontally across the plains. Elu felt the cold seeping past her skin, sinking into her organs. She knew the signs. She had seen old men in the winter camps fall asleep by a dying fire and never wake. The mind would grow confused. A false sense of warmth would bloom in the chest, making a person want to lie down and rest. She felt that heavy, seductive urge pulling at her now. Just for a moment, the wind seemed to whisper, "Just sit beneath the rock. Close your eyes." She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted the warm, metallic tang of blood. The sudden pain shattered the lethargy. "Do not stop," she croaked over her shoulder, yanking Keem forward when he stumbled. The boy fell to his knees in the snow, too weak to brace himself. Elu stopped. She turned and dropped beside him. Keme was not crying, but his body was racked with violent shivers. Suyeta stood beside them, swaying slightly, her eyes vacant. Elu looked around. The landscape offered nothing. There was a small cluster of boulders 100 paces away, but no wood for a fire, even if she had the strength or the flint to start one. The cold was closing its jaws. She pulled Keme against her chest, wrapping her own arms and the elk skin around his small body, trying to share heat that did not exist. She pressed her face into his dirty hair. "Great Spirit," she prayed silently, not looking at the sky, but addressing the deep earth beneath the snow. "Maheo'o. I do not ask for a feast. I do not ask for my husband to walk from the shadows. But do not let the frost take my sister's son. Do not let the wolves find my daughter frozen in the dark. Give me a sign. Give me a spark." She stayed like that for a long time, her eyes closed, listening to the fading beat of the boy's heart against her own ribs. Then the wind shifted. It was a subtle change in direction, a sudden gust tumbling down from the western ridge instead of the northern peaks. It caught Elu's hair, blowing it across her face. She froze, her eyes snapped open, her nostrils flared, drawing in a sharp, deep breath of the freezing air. She held it in her lungs, analyzing it like a hunter reading a track in the mud. Beneath the sterile scent of ozone and crushed ice, there was something else. It was faint, almost imperceptible, torn to ribbons by the wind. But it was there. Wood smoke. Not the acrid, terrifying smoke of a burning lodge or a prairie fire, but the sweet, heavy, intentional smell of burning cedar wood. And beneath it, something richer. Something that made her shrunken stomach clench so violently she almost gasped. Roasting meat. Elu released Kem. She stood up, her weariness vanishing, replaced by a sudden, terrifying surge of adrenaline. Fire meant warmth. Meat meant life. But fire also meant men. It could be a cavalry patrol, huddled against the cold. It could be the hide hunters, the ruthless men who killed for coin and sport. Men who would view a lone native woman and 2 children as either a bounty or prey. Or it could be a warring tribe driven into the mountains just as she had been. To go toward the fire was to walk directly into the jaws of a trap. To stay here was to freeze before morning. Elu looked down at the pale, shivering face of her daughter. The choice was already made. She reached down and pulled Kem to his feet, her grip tighter, firmer than before. She drew the rusted trade knife from her belt, the cold bone handle seating familiarly in her palm. She hit it against the fold of her skirt. "We walk," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the thick line of fir trees where the smell of smoke was strongest. "Do not speak. Walk behind me." They moved into the gathering dark, following the scent of fire, walking the invisible edge between salvation and death. The transition from the open, wind-scoured basin to the timberline was like stepping across the threshold of a great, silent lodge. The ancient Douglas firs grew thick here, their heavy, snow-laden boughs interlocking overhead to form a dense canopy that broke the spine of the wind. Beneath the trees, the air was still, and the cold felt different, no longer a biting, physical assault, but a deep, settling chill. The snow was softer, untouched by the gales rising halfway to Elu's knees, and the smell of the smoke was overpowering. It was no longer just a trace on the wind, it was a physical presence. The scent of rendering fat and roasting venison hit Elu's starved senses so hard it made her physically dizzy, her mouth flooded with saliva, painfully sharp against her parched throat. Behind her, Suyeta let out a small, desperate whimper, a sound born of pure animal hunger. Elu stopped. She raised a stiff hand, signaling for the children to halt. They stood in the deep shadow of a massive spruce trunk. "We are close," Elu whispered. She knelt, pressing her face close to Suyeta's ear. "You will stay here. You will sit on the roots of this tree and you will pull the robe over yourselves. You do not speak. If you hear me shout, or if you hear the crack of a rifle, you do not look for me. You take Keme, and you run deep into the brush, and you hide under the snow like the ptarmigan. Do you understand?" Suyeta's dark eyes widened, filled with fresh terror, but she nodded. The girl had learned the grim obedience of the hunted. She sank down into the snow between the massive roots, pulling her cousin down with her. The heavy, tattered buffalo robe covered them entirely, blending into the dark earth and shadows. Elu stood. She drew the rusted trade knife from her belt. It felt pathetically small in her numb fingers. She wiped the blade on her elk-skin dress, a gesture of nervous habit rather than utility, and stepped away from the tree. She moved with agonizing slowness. She placed each foot with deliberate care, feeling through the soft snow for hidden deadfall before shifting her weight. It was the walk of a stalker, taught to her by her father when she was no older than Suyeta. The glow of the fire appeared before the flames did, a soft, pulsing orange reflection against the snowbanks ahead. Elu crept toward a natural breastwork of piled boulders. She pressed her back against the cold stone, holding her breath, and slowly peered around the jagged edge. The camp was small, remarkably disciplined, and deeply hidden. It sat in a shallow depression beneath a rocky overhang that trapped the heat and dissipated the smoke before it could rise above the canopy. A lean-to of heavy, oil-treated canvas and pine boughs blocked the western approach. Tethered to a sturdy sapling at the edge of the firelight stood a large, deep-chested Appaloosa horse, its winter coat thick and mottled, and beside the fire sat a man. He was alone, Elu let out a slow, silent breath. One man was a risk. A group of men was a death sentence. He was a large man, broad across the shoulders, wearing a heavy coat fashioned from winter wolf skins, the fur silver and black in the firelight. Beneath the coat, he wore canvas trousers reinforced with hide, the clothing of someone who lived entirely in the rough. He was indigenous, though he wore no tribal markings, no beaded bands that announced his lineage or his people. His thick, dark hair hung loose past his shoulders. He was currently bent over the carcass of a young mule deer, expertly stripping the hide from the muscle with a blade that caught the firelight. Slabs of dark red meat were already draped over a low framework of green willow branches, sizzling and spitting fat onto the coals of a Dakota fire hole. Elu studied him. A Henry repeating rifle, a weapon of tremendous cost and deadly efficiency, rested across a log mere inches from his right hand. A heavy revolver sat in a leather holster at his hip. He moved with a steady, unhurried rhythm, entirely comfortable in the isolation. He was not a man who was lost. He was a man who had chosen the silence. Men like this were dangerous. They were wolves driven from the pack, carrying old wounds and trusting nothing. Elu knew she could not sneak past him. The horse would smell her, or he would catch the subtle shift in the shadows. She had to present herself, and she had to do it on her own terms. She stepped out from behind the boulder. She did not raise the knife, but she kept it visible by her thigh. She stood tall, fighting the tremble in her knees, projecting a strength she did not possess. She took 3 steps into the perimeter of the firelight. The man did not jump. He did not gasp or scramble for his rifle. The transition from skinning the deer to absolute stillness was instantaneous. He simply stopped moving. His hands remained bloody, resting on the deer's flank. Slowly, very slowly, he turned his head to look at her. His face was weathered, carved with deep lines of exposure and hardship. A thick, jagged scar pulled at the corner of his left eye, trailing down to his jawline, a violent mark that spoke of close-quarters survival. His eyes were the color of wet flint, cold and calculating. He looked at her haggard face, her thin, frozen dress, her patched moccasins, and the rusted knife in her hand. He calculated the threat, measured her desperation, and dismissed her as a physical danger in the span of a single breath. "A starving fox makes more noise in the snow," he said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, speaking the trade tongue of the plains, heavily accented with the cadence of the Lakota. Elu did not lower her eyes. "The wind covers many things." The man turned his attention back to the deer, slicing a long strip of meat from the haunch. "You are far from the valleys, woman. There are no camps in these mountains, only ghosts and fools." "Then we are ghosts," Elu replied. Her voice cracked slightly, betraying her thirst. The man paused. He cut the strip of meat into a thick slab, pierced it with the point of his knife, and held it over the fire. The fat sizzled loudly. He did not look at her as he spoke. "I have no use for a ghost." He pulled the meat back, half-cooked and dripping with hot grease, and tossed it. It landed in the snow midway between them, a dark, steaming offering. "Eat, then take your knife and keep walking." The smell of the meat hit Elu with the force of a physical blow. Her stomach cramped violently, a sharp stabbing pain that made her sway on her feet. Every instinct in her body screamed to drop to the snow, tear into the flesh and swallow it whole. She did not move. "I cannot pay for this," she said, her voice strained. "I have nothing to trade." The man looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I did not ask for a trade. I am not a merchant. Eat. I am not alone." The stillness returned to the camp. The man's hand drifted, resting lightly on the stock of the Henry rifle. His eyes scanned the darkness behind her, piercing the shadows. "Who?" he asked, the gravel in his voice hardening into iron. "My daughter, and my sister's son. They are in the trees." The man stared at her for a long, heavy moment. He looked at the vast, frozen expanse of the mountain pass behind her, and then back to her gaunt frame. He understood the mathematics of survival. He knew exactly what it meant for a woman to haul 2 children up the spine of the bighorns in the teeth of winter. He slowly pulled his hand away from the rifle. Bring them. Elu backed away into the shadows, never turning her back entirely. When she returned, she carried Keme, the boy too weak to walk the final steps. Suyeta clung to her mother's skirt, her eyes wide and fixed in terror on the large, scarred stranger. The man did not offer a greeting. He simply cut 2 more slabs of meat, roasted them briefly to take the chill off, and set them on a flat stone near the fire. Eluset came down. She handed a piece of meat to Suyeta and tore the other into small, manageable shreds for the boy. Eat slowly, she warned them in her own tongue. If you eat too fast, your belly will reject it. The children did not hear her. They tore into the venison with a feral intensity, their faces smeared with grease and ash. Elu watched them, her heart aching with a fierce protective relief. Only when both children had swallowed the last of their portions did Elu pick up the piece the man had thrown into the snow for her. She ate with forced dignity, chewing the tough, half-raw meat thoroughly, feeling the rich, life-giving fat coat her throat and settle into her stomach like a burning coal. It was the greatest meal of her life. The man watched them in silence. He cleaned his blade with a handful of snow and slid it into a heavily beaded sheath at his belt. He retrieved a tin cup, scooped it full of snow, and set it near the coals to melt, pushing it toward them. "My name is Elu," she said, after drinking the warm, metallic-tasting water. "Of the Tsitsistas." The man looked at the fire. "They call me Chatan." He offered no tribe, no clan name. He was a man severed from his roots. "You are pushing high," Elu observed, her eyes darting around the camp. She noted the heavy packs of dried provisions, the extra powder horns, the raw, unsalted hides stacked haphazardly near the lean-to. "You are crossing the pass before the deep snow locks it, heading for the hidden valleys to wait out the freeze." "I am." Elu pulled the buffalo robe tighter around the sleeping children. She took a deep breath. She had eaten his food. She was now in his debt, and in the harsh economy of the frontier, a debt meant leverage. But she also saw an opportunity. "Your horse is strong," Elu said evenly. "Your rifle is loud. You can hunt, and you can fight." Chatan looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I survive." "Yes," Elu agreed. "But look at your camp. Your hides are poorly scraped. They will rot before you can tan them. Your moccasins are wearing thin at the seams, stitched with gut that is too dry. You have canvas, but no proper lodge covering." Chatan's jaw tightened. "I did not invite you to my fire to judge my camp, woman." "I am not judging," Elu said, leaning forward slightly, her voice dropping to a low, intense register. "I am observing. The winter is long, Chatan. A man alone can bring down the meat, but a man alone cannot stretch the skins, smoke the flesh, gather the wood, mend the clothes, and watch the tree line while he sleeps. Isolation will kill you just as surely as the cold. You will freeze in your silence." Chatan stared at her. The wind howled high above the canopy, a stark reminder of the death waiting outside the circle of the fire. "I do not take in strays," he said. The words were not spoken with malice, but with a brutal, pragmatic honesty. "Children are slow. They are loud. The land knows no mercy for those who carry dead weight." Elu did not flinch. She matched his stare, her dark eyes blazing with the fierce, unyielding fire of a mother cornered. "It never did," Elu replied. "But we are not dead weight. I know the herbs that grow under the snow. I can work the hides until they are as soft as water. I will maintain your camp. I will mend your boots. We will be your hands, Chatan, and you will be our rifle. We will survive the winter together, and when the spring thaws the passes, we will take our own path, and you will take yours." It was a cold, transactional bargain, a marriage of sheer survival, forged over the bloody carcass of a deer in the shadow of starvation. Chatan looked at the 2 children. Suyeta was fast asleep against her mother's side, her breathing finally steady and deep. Keme was curled into a small ball beneath the robe. Chatan looked at his own scarred hands, hands built for violence, not for the delicate work of a winter camp. He looked back at Elu. He measured the iron in her spine. She was starving, half-frozen, and armed with nothing but a rusted knife, yet she sat by his fire and negotiated like a war chief. He reached over and pulled another thick slab of meat from the drying rack, handing it to her. "Wrap the children in my canvas tonight," Chatan said, his voice a low gravel scrape. "We leave before dawn. The climb will be hard." The darkness before the dawn was not merely an absence of light. It was a physical weight pressing down on the mountain with the crushing force of deep winter. Elu woke to the sound of leather groaning against frozen wood. She did not open her eyes immediately, letting her senses map the camp. The wind had dropped to a low, hollow whistle through the spruce needles. The fire was dead, buried under a mound of white ash to preserve the coals. The bitter cold had crept back under the canvas, seeping into the marrow of her bones. She opened her eyes. 10 paces away, a shadow moved within the shadows. Chatan was saddling the Appaloosa. He worked with a quiet, ruthless efficiency, strapping heavy bundles of hide and canvas to a wooden pack frame. He did not use a lantern. He tied the intricate diamond hitches by touch, his bare hands moving surely in the freezing air, seemingly immune to the frostbite that would claim a lesser man's fingers. "Wake them," Chatan said. He did not turn around. His voice was a low rumble, barely carrying over the scrape of the horse's hooves on the icy ground. "We do not wait for the sun. The sun brings the wind." Elu sat up, every muscle in her back and legs screaming in protest. The meager heat provided by the shared buffalo robe vanished the moment she lifted the edge. She shook Suyeta gently by the shoulder, then turned to Kame. The boy was stiff, his face pale, his breathing alarmingly shallow. Panic, sharp and familiar, spiked in Elu's chest. She rubbed his chest vigorously, blowing warm air into his face until he stirred with a weak cough. Breakfast was a piece of cold, frozen venison from the night before. They gnawed on it as they broke camp. There was no fire, no warm water to ease the stiffness in their throats. Survival here was a ledger of energy. Building a morning fire cost time and wood they could not afford to lose. Within minutes, the shelter was dismantled, folded tightly, and strapped to the horse. Chatan handed Elu a coil of rough hemp rope. "Tie the boy to your back," he instructed. "The snow on the pass is too deep for his legs. If he walks, he will slow us down. If he slows us down, we die on the ridge." Elu took the rope. She fashioned a makeshift sling over her elk-skin dress, hoisting Kime onto her back. The boy was painfully light, just skin and brittle bone, yet the moment his weight settled against her shoulders, Elu felt her knees buckle slightly. She bit her lip, steadying herself. She would not show weakness. She had made a bargain. They moved out just as the sky to the east began to bleed a pale, watery gray. The ascent was a brutal, agonizing exercise in endurance. The trail, such as it was, followed a narrow gorge carved by ancient glacial melt. The snow here had drifted overnight, piling in treacherous, waist-deep mounds. Chatan took the lead. He broke the trail using his sheer physical mass, plunging into the drifts, his heavy boots crushing a path for the horse. The Appaloosa followed, its breath blowing in massive white plumes from its flared nostrils, its powerful chest throwing aside the snow Chatan had loosened. Elu walked in the deep, churned trench left by the horse. She held Suyeta's hand tightly, pulling the girl along. For the first few hours, Elu's mind was a chaotic swirl of pain. The coarse hemp rope bit through her thin dress, sawing into her collarbones. Her thighs burned with the effort of lifting her legs out of the deep snow. The air grew thinner, sharper, tasting of raw ice and ozone, burning her lungs with every desperate gasp. She fixed her eyes on the Appaloosa's tail. Asterisk step, pull, breathe, step, pull, breathe. She retreated into the quiet, rhythmic prayers of her grandmothers, not asking for deliverance, but for the strength to endure just one more step. By midday, the gray light was blinding, reflecting harshly off the unbroken expanse of white. They had climbed above the timberline. The protective canopy of the spruce and fir trees fell away, leaving them exposed on a stark, slanting face of granite and ice. The wind found them. It came screaming over the jagged peaks, a horizontal blizzard of ice crystals that scoured their faces like crushed glass. Ilu lowered her head, pulling the edge of her buffalo robe over Kame, who was pressed tightly against her back, mercifully unconscious. Suddenly, the rope in Ilu's hand went taut. Suyeta had stopped. Ilu turned. The 7-year-old girl was buried to her waist in a drift, her small face streaked with dirt and melted snow. Suyeta was not moving. She was looking at her frostbitten hands, and then slowly she began to weep. It was a silent, wretched crying, her small shoulders shaking violently. She had hit the absolute limit of her endurance. "Suyeta," Ilu rasped, moving back toward her daughter. "You must stand. Give me your hand." "I cannot, ne ahe," the girl sobbed, the wind snatching the words from her mouth. "My legs are gone. I want to sleep." Ahead of them, the Appaloosa stopped. Chatan turned back. He waded through the deep snow, his massive frame blocking the wind as he loomed over the girl. Ilu instinctively stepped between them, her hand dropping to the rusted knife at her belt. She did not know what this hard, solitary man would do to a child who slowed him down. Chatan ignored Ilu. He looked down at Suyeta. His face was an unreadable mask of weathered skin and scars. He did not offer his hand. He did not speak softly. "Tears freeze on your skin, little one," Chatan said, his voice cutting through the howl of the wind with terrifying clarity. "They steal the water from your blood. They blind your eyes. The mountain does not care that you are tired. The mountain will bury you." He pointed a thick, leather-gloved finger at the Appaloosa. "You walk behind the horse. You keep your hands on his tail. His body will break the wind. If you let go, the wind will take you. Do you understand?" It was harsh. It was devoid of pity. But it was the exact, unsentimental truth of the frontier. Suyeta looked up at the giant man, her tears stopping instantly, frozen by his absolute authority. She nodded. Ilu helped her out of the drift and guided her behind the horse, wrapping the girl's numb fingers into the thick, coarse hair of the Appaloosa's tail. "Move!" Chatan grunted, turning his back on them and plunging into the snow once more. They did not stop again. When the sun finally dipped behind the western peaks, plunging the world into a deep, bruised purple, they reached a cluster of massive, overhanging boulders near the summit of the pass. It was a natural cave, sheltered from the relentless wind. The moment they entered the shadow of the rocks, Ilu collapsed. She dropped to her knees, untying the agonizing knot at her chest. Keme slid from her back, groaning softly as he hit the ground. Ilu could not stand. She lay in the dust and dry snow of the cave floor, her chest heaving, her vision swimming with black spots. But the brutal mathematics of the camp demanded action. She forced herself up. Chatan was already unpacking the horse. He did not tell her what to do. The division of labor had been silently agreed upon the night before. Ilu took the small hand axe from the pack. She ventured back out to the edge of the rocks, hacking at the dead, dry branches of a stunted juniper bush that clung to the cliff face. She gathered handfuls of dry moss and lichen. She returned to the cave and built a small, efficient Dakota fire hole, hiding the flames beneath the level of the earth to conserve heat and hide the light. Chatan brought her a frozen haunch of the deer. Ilu set to work. She did not just roast the meat. She stripped the remaining flesh, then took a heavy stone and smashed the femur bone, exposing the rich, dark marrow. She filled Chatan's battered tin pot with clean snow, set it over the coals and dropped the shattered bones into the boiling water, adding a pinch of the dried licorice root she had scavenged days ago. An hour later, the smell of rich, fatty broth filled the small cavern. Chatan sat cross-legged near the entrance of the cave, his Henry rifle resting on his knees. He watched Ilu as she worked. He watched how she wasted nothing, how she carefully fed the children the broth before taking a single sip herself. how she arranged the drying hides around the fire to reflect the heat back onto the sleeping bodies of Suyeta and Keme. She had not lied. She knew the ways of the camp. She was a survivor. The wind screamed outside, a demonic chorus of winter, but inside the small hollow, it was warm. The broth had brought color back to Keme's pale cheeks. The boy was sitting up, wrapped in the buffalo robe, his eyes wide and alert in the dim firelight. Keme's gaze was fixed on Chatan. Specifically, the boy was staring at the heavy leather scabbard resting on Chatan's thigh. The firelight caught the intricate beadwork, tiny glittering specks of red, blue, and white glass stitched into the hardened leather in a geometric pattern of striking beauty. It was an artifact of immense care and profound history, entirely at odds with the violent, ragged man who wore it. Slowly, Keme pushed his small arms out from under the robe. He began to crawl toward the massive man, drawn by the shimmering beads. Elu was scraping a piece of fat from the deer hide. She looked up, her heart suddenly seizing in her chest. "Kami," she hissed, a sharp, fearful warning. The boy did not stop. He reached Chatan's knee. Chatan's reaction was terrifyingly fast. The instinct of a man hunted by soldiers and killers took over. His hand snapped down, his thick fingers wrapping around the bone handle of the knife, his body tensing like a coiled spring. His eyes, cold and wild, locked onto the movement. Elu dropped the hide. Her own hand flew to the rusted knife at her belt. She half rose, ready to throw herself between the giant and her nephew. For a single suspended second, violence hung heavy in the smoke-filled air. Then Chatan blinked. The wildness in his eyes shattered. He looked down at the tiny, dirty hand hovering inches from his blade. He looked at Kem's face, wide with innocent curiosity, devoid of malice. Chatan's hand relaxed. He exhaled a long, shaky breath, the sound rough and uneven. Slowly, deliberately, he drew the heavy, wicked blade from the sheath. He set the naked steel on the rock beside him, far out of reach. Then he lifted the empty, beaded scabbard and placed it gently on his massive knee. He looked at Kame, a silent invitation. Kame hesitated, glancing back at Elu. Elu slowly took her hand off her weapon, nodding once, her heart hammering against her ribs. The boy reached out. His small, filthy fingers traced the lines of the glass beads. Chatan watched the boy's hand. The hard lines of the hunter's face seemed to soften, collapsing inward under the weight of a sudden, unbearable memory. "The blue," Chatan murmured. His voice was no longer a gravel scrape. It was quiet, hollow, echoing with a profound and solitary grief. "The blue is for the sky before the storm. The white is the first snow." Kame touched a jagged line of crimson beads. "And the red?" the boy whispered. Chatan closed his eyes. The firelight danced over the deep scar on his cheek. "The red is for the blood of the earth," Chatan said softly, "and the blood of those who return to it. My mother sowed this for me when I became a man." It was a staggering confession. In the unforgiving logic of the frontier, a man did not speak of his dead. He did not reveal his heart to strangers. Yet here, in the howling dark of the mountain pass, the solitary wolf had offered a piece of his soul to a starving child. Kima nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of the words, even if he did not understand their full meaning. He patted the scabbard gently, then turned and crawled back to the safety of Elu's side. Chatan opened his eyes. He picked up the sheath, slid the knife back into its home, and turned his face toward the howling mouth of the cave, staring out into the black, swirling snow. He did not speak again that night. Elu lay down, pulling the children close. She watched the broad, unmoving back of the man guarding the entrance. She realized then that Chatan was not just hiding from the soldiers or the hide hunters. He was hiding from the ghosts of his own people, and beneath his armor of ice and silence, he was bleeding to death. The descent from the high pass was in many ways more treacherous than the climb. Gravity, which had been their enemy on the ascent, now became a treacherous ally, threatening to pull them into a fatal plunge. The snow on the western slope was powder laid over solid sheets of black ice, polished smooth by the constant high-altitude winds. Every step required an agonizing, locked-knee brace against the slope. Elu's thighs burned with a deep, cramping fire, and her moccasins, though dried by the fire the night before, offered no traction. They moved in a staggered line. Chatan led, his massive frame carving a switchback path through the drifts, his Henry rifle slung tight across his back. He held the Appaloosa's lead rope short, speaking to the beast in low, guttural clicks, guiding its iron-shod hooves away from the worst of the ice slicks. Elu followed, the rope cutting into her chest once more as Keme dozed against her back, exhausted by the altitude. Suyeta walked between them, her small hand gripping the horse's tail like a lifeline. For 2 days, they navigated the steep drop, leaving the sterile, howling peaks behind and entering the timberline once more. The air grew heavier, rich with the scent of pine sap and damp earth, and the temperature rose from lethal to merely bitter. On the third afternoon, the angle of the mountain finally broke, flattening out into a wide, heavily forested basin. This was the gateway to the hidden valleys Chatan had spoken of, a labyrinth of deep canyons where the snows did not drift as high and the winter game gathered. But as they broke through a dense stand of lodgepole pines, the quiet of the wilderness was shattered. It was not a sound that broke it, but a scar upon the earth. Chatan stopped so abruptly the Appaloosa bumped into his shoulder. He did not swear, but his hand instantly went to the lever of his rifle. He stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on the ground ahead. Elu came up beside him, her hand instinctively checking the rusted knife at her belt. She looked down, cutting directly across their path, marring the pristine white surface of the basin, were deep, brutal gouges. They were the ruts of heavy wagons, the snow crushed down to the dark mud, flanked by the chaotic, churning marks of mules and iron-shod horses. The tracks were fresh. The edges of the ruts had not yet frozen solid, and the loose snow thrown up by the wheels had not been covered by the wind. Chatan knelt. He pulled his thick leather glove off with his teeth and pressed his bare fingers into the indentation of a boot print. 3 wagons, he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. 6, maybe 8 men. Heavy mules. Soldiers? Elu asked. A cold knot formed in her stomach, heavy and suffocating. She instinctively reached back, touching Kem's leg. Chatan shook his head. He lifted his hand from the snow and brought his fingers to his nose. No, soldiers march in lines. They do not smell like this. He stood up, looking toward the west, where the tracks disappeared into the deep timber. His jaw was set like granite. Hide hunters. Elu felt the blood drain from her face. The hide hunters were a plague upon the earth. They were rough, violent men, driven by the booming eastern markets for buffalo leather. They swept across the plains with heavy sharps rifles, slaughtering the great herds by the thousands. They stripped the hides and left the meat to rot under the sun, a grotesque waste that offended the spirits and starved the tribes. Worse, to a hide hunter, a solitary Native American was not a human being. They were either an annoyance to be shot for sport, or a bounty to be collected from the territorial governors who paid in silver for scalps. They are moving toward the deep valleys, Chatan said, his eyes scanning the tree line. Looking for the wintering herds, they are weighed down with salt and supplies, slower than us, but they have the easy path. Can we go around them? Elu asked. She looked at the towering, impassable cliffs flanking the basin. The snow is too deep on the ridges. If we take the horse up there, he will break a leg in the deadfall. To reach the hot springs, we have to cross this basin. Chatan looked at her, his flint-gray eyes entirely devoid of comfort. We have to cross their trail. The smell hit them an hour later. It was a foul, sickening stench that rolled through the pines on the evening breeze. It was the smell of slaughter, raw, unsalted hides, rotting fat, and the copper tang of old blood. Beneath it lay the acrid scent of cheap whiskey and unwashed men. They halted in the dense brush on a ridge overlooking a wide, snow-filled meadow. A mile across the open ground, tucked against a rock wall, A massive bonfire blazed. It was a careless, arrogant fire, built high with whole logs, throwing sparks into the darkening sky. The hide hunters felt no need to hide. They believed they were the apex predators of this land. Faintly, the sound of loud, discordant laughter and the chopping of wood drifted across the snow. "We wait for the moon to set," Chatan commanded, stepping back into the deepest shadows of the pines. "When the dark is complete, we cross." The waiting was a distinct kind of torture. The cold seeped back in, biting at their stationary bodies. Elu wrapped the children in the canvas, holding them close, not allowing them to sleep deeply for fear the cold would stop their hearts. She watched the fire across the valley, a hateful, glaring eye in the darkness. She remembered the faces of the soldiers who had burned her village, the casual, terrifying indifference in their eyes as they fired into the fleeing crowds. The men across the valley were cut from the same cloth. Hours bled away. The fire across the meadow slowly died down to a dull, angry red glow. The moon, a thin sliver of ice, finally slipped behind the western peaks, plunging the basin into absolute, suffocating darkness. "Now," Chatan whispered. They prepared in silence. Elu took scraps of thick, cured hide and wrapped them tightly around the Appaloosa's hooves, securing them with sinew. The horse shifted uneasily, disliking the strange sensation, but the muffling worked. Its steps on the frozen ground became dull, soft thuds instead of sharp cracks. "Keep the children completely covered," Chatan told her, his hand resting on the lever of his rifle. "If a flare goes up or if they shoot, you drop to the snow and you do not move until I tell you. If I fall, you leave the horse. You take the children into the rocks and you do not look back." Elu looked at him. She saw the deadly seriousness in his posture. He was preparing to die to buy them time. "We do not leave you," she said softly. Chatan's eyes flashed in the dark. "You will do exactly as I say, woman. The land does not care about your loyalty. It only cares who breathes tomorrow." He turned and stepped out of the tree line. They moved into the open meadow. The exposure was terrifying. Without the trees to break it, the wind was sharp, but the lack of cover was worse. They were moving across a vast, pale expanse of snow, relying entirely on the blackness of the night to shield them. Every crunch of Elu's moccasins sounded like a snapped bone in her ears. She walked in Chatan's footsteps, holding her breath for agonizing stretches. The horse trailed behind her, remarkably steady, guided by Chatan's low, clicking commands. Keme was a silent weight on her back. Suyeta gripped her skirt, practically vibrating with fear. They were halfway across the basin. The red embers of the hunter's fire lay to their left, perhaps 400 yards away. Elu could smell the rancid grease, the sulfur of black powder, and the sour sweat of the sleeping men. Suddenly, the wind shifted. It was a sharp, sudden gust that blew directly from the hunter's camp toward them. The Appaloosa stopped. Its head snapped up, the lead rope going taut in Chatan's hand. Elu froze. She watched the horse's ears pin flat against its skull. The beast had caught the scent of the hunter's mules, a rival herd, strange and threatening, and the overwhelming stench of fresh blood from the slaughtered hides. The horse's chest expanded. Chatan spun around, dropping his rifle to his hip, his massive hands lunging for the horse's muzzle to clamp its nostrils shut. He was a fraction of a second too late. The Appaloosa let out a shrill, piercing whinny. The sound ripped through the absolute silence of the mountain night like a physical blade, echoing off the canyon walls, high and frantic. The noise hung in the air, a death sentence suspended in the frost. In the camp across the meadow, the red embers of the fire suddenly stirred. A voice, thick with sleep and alcohol, barked a harsh command. Then, the terrifying metallic clack-clack of a heavy sharps rifle being cocked rolled across the snow. "Who's out there?" a voice roared, echoing across the basin. "Show yourselves, or I'll cut you in half." Chatan did not hesitate. He abandoned the horse's muzzle, grabbing the halter with brutal force and hauling the beast forward. "Run!" he hissed at Elu, his voice a savage, urgent rasp. "To the rocks! Now!" The descent from the high pass was, in many ways, more treacherous than the climb. Gravity, which had been their enemy on the ascent, now became a treacherous ally, threatening to pull them into a fatal plunge. The snow on the western slope was powder laid over solid sheets of black ice, polished smooth by the constant high-altitude winds. Every step required an agonizing locked-knee brace against the slope. Elu's thighs burned with a deep, cramping fire, and her moccasins, though dried by the fire the night before, offered no traction. They moved in a staggered line. Chatan led, his massive frame carving a switchback path through the drifts, his Henry rifle slung tight across his back. He held the Appaloosa's lead rope short, speaking to the beast in low, guttural clicks, guiding its iron-shod hooves away from the worst of the ice slicks. Elu followed, the rope cutting into her chest once more as Keme dozed against her back, exhausted by the altitude. Suyeta walked between them, her small hand gripping the horse's tail like a lifeline. For 2 days they navigated the steep drop, leaving the sterile, howling peaks behind and entering the timberline once more. The air grew heavier, rich with the scent of pine sap and damp earth, and the temperature rose from lethal to merely bitter. On the third afternoon, the angle of the mountain finally broke, flattening out into a wide, heavily forested basin. This was the gateway to the hidden valleys Chatan had spoken of, a labyrinth of deep canyons where the snows did not drift as high and the winter game gathered. But as they broke through a dense stand of lodgepole pines, the quiet of the wilderness was shattered. It was not a sound that broke it, but a scar upon the earth. Chatan stopped so abruptly the Appaloosa bumped into his shoulder. He did not swear, but his hand instantly went to the lever of his rifle. He stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on the ground ahead. Elu came up beside him, her hand instinctively checking the rusted knife at her belt. She looked down. Cutting directly across their path, marring the pristine white surface of the basin, were deep, brutal gouges. They were the ruts of heavy wagons, the snow crushed down to the dark mud, flanked by the chaotic, churning marks of mules and iron-shod horses. The tracks were fresh. The edges of the ruts had not yet frozen solid, and the loose snow thrown up by the wheels had not been covered by the wind. Chatan knelt. He pulled his thick leather glove off with his teeth and pressed his bare fingers into the indentation of a boot print. 3 wagons, he said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. 6, maybe 8 men, heavy mules. Soldiers? Elu asked. A cold knot formed in her stomach, heavy and suffocating. She instinctively reached back, touching Kimi's leg. Chatan shook his head. He lifted his hand from the snow and brought his fingers to his nose. No, soldiers march in lines. They do not smell like this. He stood up, looking toward the west, where the tracks disappeared into the deep timber. His jaw was set like granite. Hide hunters. Elu felt the blood drain from her face. The hide hunters were a plague upon the earth. They were rough, violent men driven by the booming eastern markets for buffalo leather. They swept across the plains with heavy Sharps rifles, slaughtering the great herds by the thousands. They stripped the hides and left the meat to rot under the sun, a grotesque waste that offended the spirits and starved the tribes. Worse, to a hide hunter, a solitary Native American was not a human being. They were either an annoyance to be shot for sport or a bounty to be collected from the territorial governors who paid in silver for scalps. They are moving toward the deep valleys, Chatan said, his eyes scanning the tree line. Looking for the wintering herds. They are weighed down with salt and supplies, slower than us, but they have the easy path. Can we go around them? Elu asked. She looked at the towering, impassable cliffs flanking the basin. The snow is too deep on the ridges. If we take the horse up there, he will break a leg in the deadfall. To reach the hot springs, we have to cross this basin. Chatan looked at her, his flint-gray eyes entirely devoid of comfort. We have to cross their trail. The smell hit them an hour later. It was a foul, sickening stench that rolled through the pines on the evening breeze. It was the smell of slaughter, raw, unsalted hides, rotting fat, and the copper tang of old blood. Beneath it lay the acrid scent of cheap whiskey and unwashed men. They halted in the dense brush on a ridge overlooking a wide, snow-filled meadow. A mile across the open ground, tucked against a rock wall, a massive bonfire blazed. It was a careless, arrogant fire, built high with whole logs, throwing sparks into the darkening sky. The hide hunters felt no need to hide. They believed they were the apex predators of this land. Faintly, the sound of loud, discordant laughter and the chopping of wood drifted across the snow. "We wait for the moon to set," Chatan commanded, stepping back into the deepest shadows of the pines. "When the dark is complete, we cross." The waiting was a distinct kind of torture. The cold seeped back in, biting at their stationary bodies. Elu wrapped the children in the canvas, holding them close, not allowing them to sleep deeply for fear the cold would stop their hearts. She watched the fire across the valley, a hateful, glaring eye in the darkness. She remembered the faces of the soldiers who had burned her village, the casual, terrifying indifference in their eyes as they fired into the fleeing crowds. The men across the valley were cut from the same cloth. Hours bled away. The fire across the meadow slowly died down to a dull, angry red glow. The moon, a thin sliver of ice, finally slipped behind the western peaks, plunging the basin into absolute, suffocating darkness. "Now," Chatan whispered. They prepared in silence. Elu took scraps of thick, cured hide and wrapped them tightly around the Appaloosa's hooves, securing them with sinew. The horse shifted uneasily, disliking the strange sensation, but the muffling worked. Its steps on the frozen ground became dull, soft thuds instead of sharp cracks. "Keep the children completely covered," Chatan told her, his hand resting on the lever of his rifle. "If a flare goes up or if they shoot, you drop to the snow and you do not move until I tell you. If I fall, you leave the horse. You take the children into the rocks and you do not look back." Elu looked at him. She saw the deadly seriousness in his posture. He was preparing to die to buy them time. "We do not leave you," she said softly. Chatan's eyes flashed in the dark. "You will do exactly as I say, woman. The land does not care about your loyalty. It only cares who breathes tomorrow." He turned and stepped out of the tree line. They moved into the open meadow. The exposure was terrifying. Without the trees to break it, the wind was sharp, but the lack of cover was worse. They were moving across a vast, pale expanse of snow, relying entirely on the blackness of the night to shield them. Every crunch of Elu's moccasin sounded like a snapped bone in her ears. She walked in Chatan's footsteps, holding her breath for agonizing stretches. The horse trailed behind her, remarkably steady, guided by Chatan's low, clicking commands. Keme was a silent weight on her back. Suyeta gripped her skirt, practically vibrating with fear. They were halfway across the basin. The red embers of the hunter's fire lay to their left, perhaps 400 yards away. Elu could smell the rancid grease, the sulfur of black powder, and the sour sweat of the sleeping men. Suddenly, the wind shifted. It was a sharp, sudden gust that blew directly from the hunter's camp toward them. The Appaloosa stopped. Its head snapped up, the lead rope going taut in Chatan's hand. Elu froze. She watched the horse's ears pin flat against its skull. The beast had caught the scent of the hunter's mules, a rival herd, strange and threatening, and the overwhelming stench of fresh blood from the slaughtered hides. The horse's chest expanded. Chatan spun around, dropping his rifle to his hip, his massive hands lunging for the horse's muzzle to clamp its nostrils shut. He was a fraction of a second too late. The Appaloosa let out a shrill, piercing whinny. The sound ripped through the absolute silence of the mountain night like a physical blade, echoing off the canyon walls, high and frantic. The noise hung in the air, a death sentence suspended in the frost. In the camp across the meadow, the red embers of the fire suddenly stirred. A voice, thick with sleep and alcohol, barked a harsh command. Then, the terrifying, metallic clack-clack of a heavy sharps rifle being cocked rolled across the snow. "Who's out there?" a voice roared, echoing across the basin. "Show yourselves or I'll cut you in half." Chatan did not hesitate. He abandoned the horse's muzzle, grabbing the halter with brutal force and hauling the beast forward. "Run!" he hissed at Elu, his voice a savage, urgent rasp. "To the rocks! Now!" They walked until the blood in their boots froze, and then they walked further. The fear of the third hunter pushed them deep into the labyrinth of the western canyons, a chaotic jumble of deadfall and steep ravines that would be impossible for a wagon or a heavy mule to navigate. By the time the sun finally crested the eastern peaks, casting a pale, cold light over the mountains, Elu was moving purely on muscle memory. Her mind had retreated to a dark, quiet place, leaving only the mechanical rhythm of putting one foot in front of the other. Chatan did not stop until the sun was high enough to cast shadows. He halted the Appaloosa near a towering wall of sheer basalt. He turned back to look at them. Elu was swaying on her feet, her eyes glazed, the rope holding Kame to her back, cutting so deeply it had drawn blood through the elk's skin. Suyeta was stumbling, her hand tied to the horse's tail with a strip of hide so she would not fall behind and freeze. "We are safe," Chatan said. His voice was a dry, hollow rasp. "The wagons cannot come here. The men will not follow. They are cowards who hunt for silver, not for blood." Elu did not answer. She simply untied the knot at her chest and let Kame slide into the snow. She dropped beside him, her forehead resting against the icy crust. Too exhausted to even shiver, Chatan stepped forward. He did not tell her to get up. He reached down, his massive arms scooping Keem up as effortlessly as a bundle of dry twigs, and tucked the boy against his broad chest. With his free hand, he grabbed the Appaloosa's lead rope. "Walk behind me," he told Elu. "It is not far." They pushed through a dense, suffocating thicket of mountain laurel, the branches snapping against their legs until the terrain suddenly dropped away. Elu stopped at the edge of the ridge, her breath catching in her throat. Below them lay a basin shaped like a massive bowl, protected on all sides by towering, impassable peaks. But it was not a bowl of white. In the center of the valley, the earth was breathing. Thick plumes of white steam rose into the freezing air, swirling like slow-moving ghosts. The snow around the center of the valley had retreated, revealing patches of deep, vibrant green moss and dark, wet earth. The air rolling up the slope was not sharp with ice. It smelled heavily of sulfur, wet stone, and profound, miraculous warmth. It was a thermal spring, a sanctuary hidden in the heart of the killing cold. The descent into the valley felt like crossing the threshold into another world. As they approached the steaming pools, the temperature rose drastically. The frost clinging to Elu's eyelashes melted, running down her cheeks like tears. The Appaloosa snorted, shaking its head violently as the ice in its mane began to thaw. Chatan led them to a flat, elevated shelf of rock overlooking the largest pool, 40 yards back from the water's edge, well clear of the sulphurous mud but fully enveloped in the ambient heat radiating from the earth. "Here," he said, dropping his packs to the ground. They did not rest. The urgency of flight was replaced by the urgent labor of settlement. This time, there was no unspoken division of labor. They moved together, driven by a desperate need to build walls against the world they had just escaped. Chatan took the hand axe and waded into the tree line, felling straight, sturdy lodgepole pines. He stripped the branches with brutal efficiency, dragging the heavy timbers back to the rock shelf. Elu took the heavy canvas and the raw buffalo hides. She did not have the tools of her village, but she had the knowledge. She directed Chatan on how to interlock the poles, not in the quick, flimsy shape of a temporary lean-to, but in the sturdy, conical frame of a true winter lodge. They worked in a synchronized rhythm, their bodies aching, their hands blistered, but fueled by the profound heat of the valley. Chatan lashed the top of the frame with heavy hemp rope. Elu dragged the canvas over the skeleton, pulling it tight against the windward side, layering the buffalo hides over it to form a dense, insulated wall. They banked the bottom of the lodge with packed earth and snow to seal the drafts. Inside, Chatan dug a proper Dakota fire hole in the center, lining it with stones from the spring to radiate the heat. Elu gathered thick, dry pine boughs, weaving them into a dense, springy mattress against the back wall. covering them with the remaining hides. By the time the sun dipped below the peaks, casting the valley in deep purple shadows, the lodge was complete. It was not elegant, but it was a fortress. Chatan struck a spark, nursing a pile of dry moss and cedar bark into a steady, smokeless flame. The moment the fire caught, casting a warm orange glow over the canvas walls, the final remnants of Elu's adrenaline evaporated. She collapsed onto the pine boughs, pulling Suyeta and Kame against her. She did not even have the strength to take off her wet moccasins. Chatan watched them fall into a deep, unconscious sleep. He did not lie down. He took his Henry rifle, walked out into the twilight, and sat on a boulder overlooking the trail they had cut, guarding the perimeter while the ghosts of the day settled into the earth. The first 3 days in the hidden valley were a blur of sleep and slow, painful recovery. The children slept almost continuously, waking only when Elu forced them to drink hot broth made from the last of the venison bones and the sweet roots she had gathered. Their bodies, starved and battered, were using every ounce of energy to knit themselves back together. Slowly, a profound quiet settled over the camp. It was not the tense, terrifying silence of the high pass, where any sound could mean death. It was the deep, resonant silence of safety. A routine formed, grounding them. Chatan hunted. The valley was a haven, not just for them, but for the game driven down from the peaks by the deep snow. He returned every few days with fresh meat, a bighorn sheep, a fat mountain goat, a brace of snowshoe hares. He was a master of his environment, moving with a silent, lethal grace that Elu respected deeply. But it was Elu who turned the meat into survival. She took over the camp. While Chatan was away, she worked with a relentless, meticulous focus. She stretched the raw hides he brought back, staking them to the earth near the hot springs, where the steam kept the leather supple. She scraped the fat away with a tool she fashioned from a sheep's shoulder blade. She rubbed the brains of the animals into the skins, a messy, arduous process, and then smoked them over a smoldering fire of green willow until they were a rich, dark amber. She took the softest, finest buckskin and began to mend. One evening, a month into their stay in the valley, the wind howled fiercely over the peaks, but inside the lodge, it was stiflingly warm. The fire crackled cheerfully. Chatan was sitting cross-legged near the door, cleaning the mechanism of his Henry rifle with a piece of oiled rag. Kame was asleep, a healthy flush finally returning to his cheeks. Suyeta was sitting near Elu, practicing her weaving with strands of dried grass. Elu finished the final stitch on a heavy leather boot. She bit off the sinew, inspecting her work. She stood up and walked over to Chatan. She did not speak. She simply dropped the boot in his lap and then set its mate down beside it. Chatan stopped cleaning his rifle. He picked up the boots. They were his boots, the heavy frontier-made leather he had worn for years, but the blown seams were repaired. The soles, which had been worn dangerously thin, were reinforced with thick, hardened buffalo hide, stitched so tightly with wet sinew that they were now entirely waterproof. The insides were lined with the soft white winter fur of a snowshoe hare. He stared at the craftsmanship. He ran his thick thumb over the perfectly even stitches. He looked up at her. He wore a heavy, ragged canvas shirt, the collar frayed and stained with the grease of 100 campfires. "Take off your shirt," Elu commanded quietly. Chatan hesitated. His flint-gray eyes flickered with a sudden, rare vulnerability. But he set the boots down, reached up, and pulled the heavy canvas over his head. His torso was a map of violence. It was a landscape of scars, burns, knife slashes, and the puckered, distinct entry and exit wounds of a heavy-caliber bullet near his left shoulder. It was the body of a man who had thrown himself into the jaws of the world and somehow crawled back out. Elu did not stare at the scars. She did not offer pity. She held out a folded bundle she had been keeping behind her back. Chatan took it. He unfolded the material. It was a new shirt. It was made of the finest, brain-tanned buckskin she had produced, smoked to a deep golden brown. The leather was as soft as water, pliable and warm. The seams were sewn with absolute precision, the fringes cut long to wick away the rain. Across the shoulders, she had sewn a subtle geometric pattern using dyed porcupine quills, a pattern that spoke of protection, of the high mountains, of strength. It was a garment made by a woman for her husband, for a chief, for a man she deeply respected. Chatan stared at the shirt, the firelight casting long shadows across the deep scar on his face. His hands, which had crushed a man's throat without hesitation, were trembling slightly as they traced the quill work. "I have nothing to pay you for this," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh, tight whisper. "I am a man of the dirt. You paid for it in the pass," Elu replied, her voice soft but unyielding. "You paid for it with the meat that feeds my children. A man cannot hunt if he freezes. Put it on." Slowly, Chatan slid his arms into the sleeves and pulled the soft, warm leather over his head. It fit him perfectly, stretching across his broad shoulders, holding the heat of his body against his skin. He looked at his hands, then at the repaired boots, and finally he looked at Elu. For the first time since she had stepped out of the shadows and into his camp, the cold defensive wall in his eyes shattered completely. The dangerous, solitary wolf who trusted no one looked at the starving widow who had forced her way into his life, and he saw what he had lost years ago. He saw home. He reached out and gently caught her wrist before she could turn away. His grip was not the bruising hold of a warrior, but a desperate, terrifyingly gentle touch. "Elu," he whispered, speaking her name for the very first time. It sounded like a prayer in his rough throat. Elu looked down at his hand holding hers. The silence in the lodge was absolute, save for the crackle of the fire and the soft, even breathing of the children. "The winter is long, Chatan," she said softly, echoing the words she had spoken the night they met. "It is," he replied, his thumb brushing over the pulse point at her wrist. He looked up, his eyes locking onto hers, filled with a quiet, undeniable reverence. "But I am no longer freezing." Elu smiled. It was a small, fragile thing, breaking through the hardened mask of her grief. She did not pull her hand away. She sank to her knees beside him in the warmth of the fire, the howling of the mountain wind suddenly seeming very far away. The turning of the season did not announce itself with a sudden, triumphant break of the sun. It came softly, a subtle shift in the smell of the wind and the slow, rhythmic dripping of water from the eaves of the lodge. The deep, suffocating freeze broke. The snow in the hidden valley, which had formed a massive, impenetrable bowl of white, began to retreat. It pulled back from the trunks of the ancient firs, exposing a ring of dark, wet earth. The thermal spring in the center of the camp seemed to exhale a wider breath, thawing the frozen creek that fed the lower basin. For Elu, the sound of running water was the sound of a miracle. She stood at the edge of the stream, her feet bare, feeling the icy, rushing current rush over her ankles. For months, water had been something they had to fight for, chopping ice, melting snow over precious fires, hoarding every drop. Now, it poured over the rocks in reckless, beautiful abundance. She closed her eyes, letting the pale spring sun warm her face. The hollow, haunted gauntness of the winter had faded from her cheeks. The constant, gnawing pain in her belly was a memory. The heavy elk-skin dress she wore was clean, the fringes mended, the leather soft and supple. She was alive. They had survived the starving moon. She opened her eyes and looked back toward the camp. The lodge stood strong, the canvas and hides bleached slightly by the winter sun, smoke curling lazily from the top hole. Nearby, Suyeta was carefully laying out thin strips of venison on a wooden rack to dry in the mild air. The girl was humming a low, wordless tune, a song of their people that Elu had not heard since the soldiers came to their summer camp. The sound of her daughter singing felt like a physical weight lifting from Elu's chest. Down by the edge of the tree line, Chatan was sitting on a fallen log. Kime sat on the earth between the giant man's knees. Chatan was holding a long, slightly curved piece of seasoned ash wood. He was using his heavy hunting knife, the one that had taken the lives of the hide hunters, not for violence, but to carefully, meticulously shave the belly of the wood. Elu walked silently closer, pausing behind a thick pine trunk to watch them. "You do not force the wood," Chatan was saying. His deep, gravelly voice softened to a steady, patient rumble. "The wood knows what it wants to be. You are only helping it shed what it does not need. You follow the grain. If you cut against it, the bow will snap when you need it most." Kami was watching with absolute rapt attention. The boy, who had been a dying, silent ghost months ago, was now sturdy, his eyes bright and focused. He wore a small buckskin shirt that matched Chatan's, crafted by Elu from the remnants of the hides. "Like this?" Keme asked, reaching out his small hand to guide Chatan's massive, scarred fingers along the wood. Chatan did not pull away. He let the boy's hand rest over his own, guiding the knife together in a long, smooth scrape. "Yes," Chatan murmured, "like that. You have the hands for it, Keme. You will be a maker." Elu pressed her hand against the rough bark of the pine tree, a sudden, fierce knot of emotion rising in her throat. She remembered the fierce, solitary wolf she had met in the high pass, a man who had stripped himself of all ties, who had believed he would die alone in the ice. Now he was passing on the sacred knowledge of the makers to a boy of a different blood, anchoring himself to the future. That evening the air grew crisp as the sun dropped behind the peaks, a reminder that the winter had merely retreated, not surrendered. They gathered around the fire inside the lodge. They ate roasted grouse and a mash of wild spring onions and sweet roots Elu had dug from the newly thawed earth. It was a feast compared to the desperate rations of the pass. The mood was quiet, comfortable, filled with the easy silence of people who knew exactly how the others breathed in the dark. When the children finally fell asleep on the thick pine bough beds, wrapped securely in the buffalo robes, the silence shifted. Chatan remained sitting near the fire hole. He picked up a piece of dry cedar and fed it to the flames, watching the sparks dance upward toward the smoke vent. "I tracked a black bear today, down by the lower gorge," Chatan said softly, not looking at Elu. She was thin, just out of her winter sleep, but she was moving toward the plains. Elu sat across from him, mending a tear in one of the canvas packs. Her hands stilled. "The game is moving down. The snow is gone from the lower ridges," Chatan continued, his voice heavy, carefully devoid of inflection. "The rivers are breaking up. The pass we crossed is a muddy trail now, but it is clear." He finally looked up, his flint-gray eyes meeting hers across the low flames. "The spring has come, Elu." The words hung in the warm air of the lodge, heavy with the weight of the bargain they had struck months ago. "When the spring comes, we part." It had been a desperate promise made to secure his protection, a guarantee that she and her children would not be a permanent burden on a man who walked alone. Elu looked at him. She looked at the deep scar on his cheek, the powerful line of his jaw, the heavy shoulders beneath the buckskin shirt she had sewn for him. She saw the man who had starved himself so her children could eat, the man who had thrown himself into a camp of murderers with nothing but a knife to buy them time to run. "I know," Elu said quietly. She set her sewing aside. "Our bargain is met," Chatan said. His voice was tight, a man bracing himself for a blow. "You are a free woman. The plains are open. If you wish to search for the remnants of the tsitsistas, I will give you the horse. I have packed enough dried meat to last you a moon. You will not starve." He was giving her an out. He was offering her the freedom to return to her people, to seek out her past, without asking for anything in return. It was the most profound act of respect he could offer, but Elu heard what he did not say. She heard the agonizing, solitary resignation of a man preparing to return to the silence. Elu stood up. She walked around the small fire and knelt directly in front of him. Chatan looked down at his hands, his jaw clenched tight. Elu reached out. She took his massive, calloused hands in hers, just as she had done in the bloody snow outside the hunter's camp. But this time she did not wash them. She simply held them, her grip firm and anchoring. "And where would I go, Chatan?" she asked, her voice a low, steady murmur. "The summer camps are ashes. The world I knew before the snows is gone. I am not the woman who ran from the soldiers. The winter took her." She leaned closer. "I told you once that a man alone cannot mend his nets and watch the shadows," Elu said. "But a woman alone cannot build a lodge in the wilderness. She cannot carve a bow for a fatherless boy. She cannot hold back the wolves." Chatan slowly raised his eyes. The absolute, stark vulnerability in his gaze took her breath away. "I am a man of the dirt, Elu," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I have blood on my hands that will never wash clean. I have no village, no tribe to offer you. I have only this valley and the rifle." "I do not want a village," Elu replied fiercely, her eyes shining in the firelight. "I have a tribe. It is sleeping behind you, and it is sitting in front of me." She raised her hand, her fingertips gently tracing the deep, jagged scar that ran from his eye to his jaw. He closed his eyes, leaning into her touch with a desperate, heavy exhaustion, surrendering the last stubborn pieces of his isolation. "You bound me to nothing," Elu whispered, leaning her forehead against his. "I chose this fire. I choose to stay." Chatan exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to carry the weight of 100 lonely winters. He brought his arms up, wrapping them around her waist, pulling her against his chest. He held her not with the bruising grip of a warrior, but with the careful, protective reverence of a man holding the very center of his world. There was no grand celebration. The world outside the hidden valley was still brutal, chaotic, and dangerous. The soldiers would continue to march. The treaties would be broken, and the frontier would bleed. There was no perfect happiness to be found on this shifting earth. But as the mountain wind blew over the sturdy canvas of the lodge, Elu rested her head against the chest of the solitary wolf, listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart. They were outcasts, survivors carved from grief and ice, holding fast to one another in the dark. And for the first time in her life, the sound of the wind did not sound like a warning. It sounded like home.